Down it is.
You know, I never wanted to be a witch hunter.
Oh, is that right, sir? You had a particular career in mind?
Yes, a steam tank driver. Think of it. Crushing all in my path.
Oh, sounds lovely. Oh, maybe there's a wheelbarrow we could borrow.
No, it wouldn't be the same. It won't have a whistle. Woo, woo! You know, like, woo, woo! I'm a steam tank. Woo, woo! You see?
My blood cries out for the vengeance of my people's blood, which can only be repaid with at least twice as much blood, or maybe 3 times as much blood. Like if you went to hell, and it was full of blood, and that blood was on fire, and it was raining blood, and maybe that would be enough blood. But probably not. You shall be king.
Stomach settling. Killer rage rising!
What's up, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Killer Kruber King of Bling Melee Mastery Mechanics Guide. Dramatic music, please.
Look, Simba. Everything the light touches is our kingdom.
You ruled all of that?
Yes, but a king's time as ruler rises and falls like the sun. One day, Simba, the sun will set on my time here and will rise with you as the new king.
All of this will belong to me?
But will be yours to protect. A great responsibility.
Sword and mace. And just right off the bat, look at the glow on that sword. Now that's what a party knife is supposed to look like. Like Kruber truly is the undisputed king of bling bling. But as far as the actual weapon goes, as always, we're gonna start off simple and slowly move our way up the ladder of complexity as we go through each of Kruber's melee weapons one by one, discussing and showcasing their optimal attack sequences in relation to different specific enemy spawns. But before we get to that, I thought I'd start things off by digging just a little bit deeper into the underlying logistics used to determine what attacks might be preferable in different situations, as this can actually vary even when comparing 2 scenarios where we're using the same weapon and fighting identical minion types, which at first seems super counterintuitive. I mean, if you're using the same weapon, thus the same attack, versus the same minion type, shouldn't one attack always be better than the other? But the answer is no, and this comes down to 2 factors. The most obvious of which is the difference between having an abundance of stamina and none left at all, which would obviously influence any sequence involving either a push or a push block attack. But even if we eliminate this variable and assume identical stamina in both scenarios, using the mace and sword as an example, simply by increasing the minion density of, let's say, a horde, you will eventually reach a critical threshold, at which point you can no longer reliably trust your light attacks to be able to cleave and stagger through enough minions to safely continue your attack sequence indefinitely. At some point we would have to either block or switch to another sequence. Now, 9 out of 10 times when we're talking about the optimal attack sequence versus a given minion, it really just comes down to the string of attacks that deals as much damage as possible to as many of that minion as possible, and preferably in as little time as possible, which most of the time is just fine. But this ain't no basic bitch guide, and on Legend, but especially on Cataclysm difficulty, you would have to switch to your heavy attack sequence at some point, sacrificing your damage output for stagger and cleave in order to prevent taking damage mid-sequence whenever dealing with higher minion densities. Anyways, with that little software update installed to your repertoire of Vermintide knowledge, we should probably move the fuck on since Kruber has a lot of melee weapons. Now, when fighting trash minions with the sword and mace, your best attack sequence, hypothetically speaking, is just spamming push block attacks. However, this is not viable in the long run, and thus I suggest chaining 2 light attacks together after the push block attack in order to conserve your stamina. Now, if for whatever reason you do run completely out of stamina, or if you just find yourself taking damage more often than you feel like you should, try switching over to your heavy attack sequence and combine it with some clever movement, which should also be more effective at generating temporary HP, especially if you're using the based off stagger strength talent. Now, as for the unarmored elites, it's pretty straightforward. You're simply gonna sequence together your heavy attacks, and for berserkers specifically, you're obviously always gonna try to headshot them, which is actually fairly easy once you get used to the weapon, although the heavy attack sequence might feel awkward at first if you're very used to weapons like the axe and falchion or the dual daggers. However, as for the armored elites, you're gonna be doing something quite a lot more interesting. Which is exactly the same thing? Okay, I lied. It's not more interesting. But on the bright side, you aren't entirely restricted to this attack sequence, since you do have a small amount of armor damage on all of your attacks, both light, heavy, and push. But your heavy attack sequence is definitely what's gonna be most prevalent whenever you are fighting armored elites. Now, last but not least, I just wanna mention that like many other dual wield weapons, spamming your light attack sequence does increase your distance traveled, aka your movement speed, relative to your attack speed. Not a dildo. I mean, a one-handed mace. I mean, come on guys, it's called the boobity stick. And it's actually quite a nifty little weapon. And the first thing you might notice is that it has an unusual amount of stamina for a one-handed weapon. In fact, the boobity stick has the single highest stamina count of any one-handed weapon in the game. Doesn't this seem a bit suspicious? Maybe you should ask yourself, what exactly does it need all that stamina for? And like, not to paint any inappropriate picture in your mind, I would never do that. But before you grab this weapon, no pun intended, you might want to ask yourself, what exactly does it need all of this stamina for, huh? No, but for real though, whenever you're fighting trash minions, you're gonna be using a sequence of 2 light attacks combined with a push attack. Now, on paper, the third light attack has exactly the same properties as the 2 first light attacks, but simply due to the attack angle of the third attack, it's extremely inefficient at hitting multiple enemies, and is sorta like an uppercut setting up the 4th overhead attack, which we're gonna use against the 360 unarmored elites. Now, as with so many other weapons, theoretically speaking, you could probably deal more damage simply by standing and spamming your light attack sequence. But in reality, most of the time when you're fighting a berserker, it's also gonna be fighting you. And so quite often you're at least gonna be initiating with a heavy attack first. Now what you can do to optimize your damage is chain together 2 heavy attacks, followed by 2 light attacks, in order to utilize the 4th and most powerful overhead light attack, which has the highest infantry damage. But anyways, let's do a mandatory hat switcheroo as we move on to the armored elites. Now here, you don't really have a lot of options. You're mostly gonna be using your heavy attack sequence since they provide good overhead attacks that are easy for getting headshots. But the truth is, you don't really have that many options, since the only other attack in the mace sequence that provides any armor damage is the 4th light attack. Which means you could in theory use the same sequence we used against the unarmored elites and chain together 2 light attacks on top of 2 heavy attacks. But I think a more important use for this attack in terms of armored enemies comes into play when you're fighting a mixed pool of enemies, where it can be useful to spam your light attack sequence and then time and aim your 4th light attack specifically such that it hits an armored enemy. Sword and not mace, which unlike the axe and not falchion, is just fine with being single. I mean, who wants to settle down at this power level anyway? Maybe the sword just wants to roam free a little bit and live life. And you know, it's not like the mace is the only weapon in the armory, if you know what I mean. No, but the one-handed sword, which I should mention is identical to Sienna's one-handed sword, is a great and very versatile weapon, which combines amazing cleave and stagger attacks with really strong mass modifiers. And it's altogether a fairly easy weapon to use, but it does have at least 2 sequences, which just helps to take the weapon to another level. And the 2 important things to notice here is the 3rd light attack and the stagger and tank mass modifier on the heavy attacks. Now, because this previously mentioned 3rd light attack is an overhead attack, you're gonna sequence together 2 light attacks with a push block attack, which helps to both stagger the enemies and reset the sequence. Now, because I'm playing on the mercenary Kruber here, I can get much more attack speed, which is why it's gonna drain my stamina incredibly quickly, which probably wouldn't be the case if you were on a huntsman, for example. But if you do run out of stamina, or if you're just fighting a horde with an incredibly high density, you might find it advantageous to switch to a combo of 1 light attack and 1 heavy attack in order to better stagger the enemies. Now, I can only speak from my own experience on this matter, but personally I feel like this is safer than just sequencing together 2 heavy attacks. But again, most of the time you are going to be using this push block attack and 2 light attacks. So with that said, I suggest we move on to the unarmored elites. Now here we're gonna keep it pretty simple, with the exception of perhaps initiating with 1 heavy attack on a berserker. In order to hopefully stagger it, you're simply just gonna be spamming your light attack sequence, as this by far provides the best infantry damage, and allows us to quickly move on to the armored elites. And this is where that 3rd light attack we talk about really proves useful, since the heavy attacks only provide small amounts of armor damage, and are neither overhead attacks or very fast for that matter. And so assuming you headshot with the third attack, this sequence nearly triples your armor damage if you compare it to simply just spamming your heavy attacks, which I think we can all agree is a fairly significant amount, and definitely enough to prove worthwhile of your efforts. But anyways, I think that's just about all there is to say about the one-handed sword, which is why we're gonna move on to its older brother. The Greatsword, or as I like to call it, Frostmourne. Now, those of you with a keen eye might have noticed that this is in fact not Kruber's Greatsword, it is in fact Saltspire's Greatsword. But just like with Sienna and the one-handed sword, these two weapons are completely identical in every single way, with the only exception being their available illusions, likely to make them easier to distinguish from one another. And as you can see from the armory here, it really is in a lot of ways just a beefed up version of the one-handed sword, although with slightly different properties. And as you can see, it also has amazing mass modifiers, but the important thing to notice here is the armor damage on the push block attack and the amazingly set cleave metric of 21.21. I guess someone is old enough to drink in the States now. Yay! But for real though, hordes should prove little to no obstacle for you with this weapon. And really you can use any combination of heavy and light attacks that you see fit, but personally my own preference would be to initiate with a heavy attack and then follow that up with your light attack sequence. Now, I also covered this weapon in the Saltspire video, but on request from a highly specifically leveled lobster who shall remain unnamed, I must inform you that whenever using the heavy attack sequence, you can utilize a dodge in between attacks to actually increase your dodge distance. As I sorta tried, but sorta failed at showcasing properly here, but I think you get the point anyways. And if you don't, then too bad, get over it. You can instead have a free 360! That was horrible, here's another. What are you looking at, bitch? Come at me, bro. Fuck you. Now, whenever fighting unarmored elites, you're mostly going to be initiating with your heavy attack sequence, and this is because it's simply much safer. Now, your light attack sequence deals more damage, or actually it deals identical damage, but it attacks quicker, which is why the light attack sequence is preferable if you have the space required to actually do it safely. You can also throw in a push block attack here and there, although this is slightly risky versus berserkers. It is, however, exactly what you're gonna do versus armored elites, since the push block attack has a higher armor damage than the heavy attack, and again is much easier to get headshots with. It will, however, drain your stamina incredibly quickly, and whenever you don't have the stamina to keep going, you're gonna switch into your heavy attack sequence since your light attacks don't deal any armor damage. And in my own personal opinion, to be quite honest, this weapon is sort of one-dimensional if you ask me. But god damn does it have some amazing looking fucking weapon skins. It's so unfair. The Greathammer, the greatest of hammers. Now all you need is a great nail and then it would be like super duper useful. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, those of you who've watched my Kruber mastery guide might recall that I mentioned almost nothing about the Greathammer other than the fact that I felt hopelessly unqualified to talk about it because I simply haven't used the weapon that much, at least not in the context of Kruber, although I did play a couple of games with it in preparation for this video. I have, however, used an identical version of this weapon on the Slayer quite extensively. And although that's not exactly the same, regardless, I think we're gonna be just fine, because this weapon has about as many weapon combinations as the two-handed sword. But unlike the Greatsword as far as hordes go, there's only one thing to do, and that is the heavy attack. And admittedly, this can make the weapon feel a little bit bulky, since it also has an effective dodge count of 2, and an effective dodge distance modifier of 0. But to be fair, this is quite an amazing heavy attack, with 22 in stacker and the tank mass modifier. And with that said, let's move on to the unarmored elites, which provide at least a bit of complexity. Now, there's no doubt that damage-wise, you're gonna be looking for your light attack sequence. However, as I said with so many other weapons, you might want to initiate here with a heavy attack simply in order to stagger the enemies coming at you. But assuming you have the space needed to just spam out your light attacks, that's definitely what's gonna be preferable here. However, even when using your light attacks, you might as well try to avoid the third light attack that on paper is identical to the two first, but with a much worse angle of attack, and is in practice a side sweep with no cleave or stagger, which simply makes it harder to get headshots. Now, whenever you're fighting a few armored elites, you're definitely going to be going again for your light attacks, cancelling after the two first in order to maximize the amount of headshots you can get. This is done by doing a quick block cancel after the two first light attacks and then continuing the sequence. Now, one major reason this weapon differs in strength from a slayer using the two-handed hammer comes down to the swap cancel simply not being as effective on the Kruber as it is on the slayer, since you have to do a double swap rather than just a single swap. And to be quite honest, it's not even worth trying on the Kruber, since the double light attack into a block cancel attacks equally fast and is simply much easier to perform input-wise. Now, if you're ever fighting multiple elites, such as if you pull the Storm Vermin Patrol, you definitely want to consider using your heavy attack sequence in order to stagger the enemies. But damage-wise, there's just no doubt that the light attack is the way to go, so double light attack into a block cancel and repeat. The Greatsword, Prepare to Die edition, better known as the Executioner's Sword, and is basically the OG equivalent of having huge 21-inch chrome rims on your black BMW. I mean, just look at the fucking bling on this weapon. Those engravings look freaking badass, but more than that, the Executioner's Sword is just fucking amazing. However, just like the Greathammer, it can feel a little bit bulky since it has an effective dodge count of 2 and a distance modifier of 0. However, unlike the Greathammer, it has great forward momentum on the heavy attacks, which does help make it feel quite a lot more mobile, and combines an absolutely insane amount of single target armor damage with a 20% crit chance modifier, and a light attack sequence with the tank mass modifier, which is just even more insane. And I should mention that to the best of my knowledge, this is still considered Kruber's best melee weapon. Now, whenever fighting trash minions, it's pretty goddamn simple. You're just gonna be spamming your light attack sequence. Although prior to proccing Swift Slaying or any other attack speed modifier, you might want to consider throwing in a push here and there, especially if you're fighting a high density horde, in order to avoid taking damage. However, once you do proc Swift Slaying or any other attack speed modifier for that matter, you should be good to go just spamming your light attack sequence. Now, you can initiate with a heavy attack in order to get a one-time plus 20% crit chance of hopefully proccing your Swift Slaying before then continuing with your light attack sequence and slicing through hordes like a lawnmower cutting grass. And once you're done mowing your lawn and it looks nice and trimmed, you can proceed to the unarmored elites, whom you can imagine just walked on your freshly mowed lawn, so obviously now they have to die. And for this act of totally justified murder, you're definitely gonna be using your heavy attacks. They provide the highest infantry damage as well as easy headshots. If however there are a lot of trash minions also involved, it might be advantageous on the mercenary Kruber to throw in some light attacks here and there just to proc your paced strike. But most of the time you're just gonna be throwing those heavy attacks in their face. However, one really important thing when you are using your heavy attack sequence, at least in my own personal experience, I really dislike chaining your heavy attacks together. I much prefer using the first heavy attack, doing a block cancel, and then initiating the next heavy attack. At first, I thought it might be because the second heavy attack blocked more of the screen, but when I tested this hypothesis, it turned out not to be true. Yet I really felt like I had an easier time aiming with the first heavy attacks, so I kept searching for a logical explanation, until it dawned on me that perhaps it wasn't because it was blocking more of the screen, but it was blocking a more crucial part of the screen and perhaps for longer periods of time. And so I eventually ended up counting the amount of frames in which my crosshair, aka the center of the screen, was visually blocked by the attack animation, and this number will obviously vary depending on your attack speed, and it ended up being something like 3 to 4 frames on the first heavy attack, while it was more like 11 to 12 on my second heavy attack. Oh yeah, and on top of that, you're also gonna be attacking quicker due to the animation cancel, and I would say significantly quicker whenever you proc your Swift Slaying. But anyways, I think we're ready to move on. The Spear Axe. All hail the Halbard. Now, there's no getting around the fact that this is probably one of the coolest looking weapons in the entire game. And it even has a skin called the Stick of Doom. And doomed is exactly what you're going to be if you're using this weapon but don't know how to use it properly. And it's definitely a weapon you should not use if you don't know how, which is an absolutely pointless statement, since either you don't know how and then you don't know that you don't know how, or you didn't know how but now you're here so now you're gonna know how, or maybe you already knew, in which case it doesn't apply to you anyways. Wait, where was I? Oh yeah, Halbard. Now, as you can see in the armory, this weapon doesn't have 2 attacks that are the same. Also, the only 2 attacks that it has with any cleave is its light attack one and its heavy attack one, and can thus not be sequenced together. and it also has a minus 5% on its dodge distance modifier, which is 5% less than a shielded weapon. Now either of those factors on their own might not be an issue, but when you combine them all, you get a weapon with one of the highest skill requirements in the game, especially on higher difficulties where this weapon can tend to struggle. Now you can either do a sequence of push light attack, and then repeat that sequence, or, quick warning, if you're prone to motion sickness, you might want to look away now. You can light attack, block cancel, light attack, block cancel, light attack, block cancel, and just repeat that sequence. Now one way you can help this weapon along, using a mechanic we haven't really discussed yet, is to constantly swipe your camera angle from right to left in order to increase the area of potential collision between your attack and the enemy minions. Now hypothetically speaking, you could do a 360 and have an attack that actually collided with every single minion in a circle around you. Obviously in practice this doesn't work for two reasons. First of all, doing a 360 the entire time is not exactly practical, and probably pretty damn disorientating. But more importantly than that, it likely wouldn't work simply because your attack is unlikely to be able to cleave through all of those minions. But assuming you just had one minion behind you and you were able to turn fast enough, then it would work. But obviously this is only useful where you aren't already utilizing your cleave to the maximum. In other words, if this attack was capable of cleaving and damaging 7 clan rats, yet I only hit 5 of them, then I could use this camera swipe to sort of stretch my attack animation and hit 2 enemies that were otherwise too far on my right or left side. Now, whenever you're fighting the unarmored elites, you have a couple of options. Obviously you can always use your light attack sequence, since that's just always an option. Your second choice is to do a push block attack into light 1 and then repeat that sequence. Now this is a great way of getting easy and high DPS headshots, although this sequence should be avoided whenever you're fighting a mauler, since their heads are heavily armored and they will thus take less damage whenever you hit them in the head. In other words, just to be very clear, it's in your best interest to hit a mauler on the body and not in the head. One way to get around this problem is to do a double light attack followed by a heavy attack, in order to get around the third and final attack in the sequence, since it's an overhead attack. Now let's move on to the armored elites. Now here there are basically 2 sequences that you have to alternate between depending on your current remaining stamina. Now the most optimal sequence DPS wise is a simple push block attack followed by a light attack, but this will drain your stamina incredibly quickly. But what you can do instead in order to ration your stamina is to put an extra light and heavy attack on the sequence, so it goes push block attack into a double light attack into a heavy attack and then repeat. Now the idea behind this sequence is to still deal effective armor damage while providing a gap large enough between your 2 push block attacks for your stamina to regenerate in between cycles, allowing you to continue this sequence indefinitely. Mace and Shield, which is probably the closest thing you're gonna get to dual wielding shields in this game. Oh my god guys, dual wield shield, the stagger would be amazing. Speaking of which, stagger is something we'll get into in more detail in the bonus section at the end. But for now, sticking with the Mace and Shield, there are a couple of important things to notice in the armory. Starting with the light attack sequence, which has insane stagger metrics and a full set of tank mass modifiers. Then we have the push block attack and heavy 1 attack, which are the 2 only attacks that deal any armor damage. But also look at the insane freaking stagger on the heavy 1 attack, in relation to which the heavy 2 attack just seems even more crappy, assuming the armory is accurate. Now, as for fighting hordes, your light attack sequence is just fine, although you should most definitely throw in a push here and there, since you have very low mobility with shielded weapons. There is however another option which might be preferable whenever you proc your swift slaying, since, as you hopefully learned by now, the benefit of animation cancelling increases exponentially as you increase your attack speed. And if that confuses you, watch my ranged mastery mechanics for a more detailed explanation. But for now, the thing you can do here is simply use your heavy 1 attack, do a block cancel and repeat the sequence, which also has the added benefit of generating insane amounts of temporary HP with the correct talent, since it's based off the stagger strength. Now let's do a mandatory 360 and proceed with the unarmored elites. Now, just like always with these freaking unarmored elites, your light attack sequence, hypothetically speaking, has the highest infantry damage output. However, this doesn't take headshots into account, which is why more often than not your push block attack, which is an overhead attack, will be more preferable. If however you're fighting a mixed pool of enemies, or a very large number of unarmored elites for that matter, I would use the previously mentioned combo of heavy 1, block cancel, heavy 1, since it has the best chance to stagger multiple enemies. Now, when you're fighting armored elite, obviously the best combo you have is to simply spam your push block attack for armor damage and overhead headshots. However, this is gonna run out of stamina extremely quickly, and whenever you're down to 1 or 2 stamina, you should instead, as with so many other weapons, use the budget sequence, which in this case consists of the push block attack into a double heavy attack, giving you an overhead attack first, followed by a shield bash for stagger, and then going back to your heavy 1 attack, which, if you remember correctly, is the only attack other than the push block attack which has any armor damage at all whatsoever. The push and poke stick. Oh wait, maybe the spike of dislike or something. Nah, it doesn't work. Okay, you know what, screw it. The Tuskgor Spear. Now, as you may know, or may not know, which is why I'm gonna tell you, this is personally my favorite Kruber weapon, which in a lot of ways is really sad. Because of all the freaking Kruber weapons, perhaps with the one exception of the one-handed mace, this is the only fucking weapon he has which has no good looking skins. Like, I'm not saying it's decidedly ugly, but it's like me, which is kinda sad compared to Kruber's other weapons. But anyways, this weapon has an amazing push block attack and an amazing second heavy attack. And the struggle people often have with this weapon usually comes from the fact that only 1 out of its 4 light attacks, specifically the 3rd in the sequence, has any cleave. But worry not, there is a sequence to get around this. Also notice in the bottom right corner that it has a push radius of 2.75. which is equivalent of a 10% increase for the distance at which you can push an enemy minion. And this is probably the single least varying stat across all Vermintide weapons. If I recall correctly, only 2 other weapons in the entire game, give or take 1 since I didn't double check it right now, don't have a push radius of 2.5. And whilst 10% doesn't sound like much, in my own personal experience it definitely makes a difference. But anyways, let's get back to the real subject, which is fighting hordes. Now, in a perfect world with infinite stamina, you would simply just spam your push block attack. But as I've hopefully smashed into your skull by now, this only provides a short-term solution. And it's always better to anticipate the problem rather than suddenly running out of stamina. And a simple light attack followed by a heavy attack is a sequence you can use to both follow up the push block attack and supplement it to conserve your stamina, but it's also strong enough on its own to deal with nearly all but the most extreme densities of hordes. And the sequence can be initiated without the push block attack simply by doing a light attack, then a heavy attack and repeating. Now, as for the unarmored elites, those of you who watch my Saltspire melee mechanics guide probably remember this light attack sequence I used on the billhook, which I referred to as my single favorite sequence with that weapon. And well, in a way, it kinda still is on this weapon. Like, it's not the sequence you're gonna be using the most, since its primary focus is single target infantry damage, but it just feels so good to just stab, light attack cancel, light attack cancel, light attack cancel. But in reality, you are going to be using the previously mentioned combo a lot more often. Now, if you don't like to animation cancel, you can simply swap this sequence for your light attack sequence. And if you're fighting a mixed pool of enemies, you definitely want to use either your push block attack or the previously mentioned combo. But seriously, try it. The more attack speed you have, the more fun this combo is, and it's a great way to practice your block cancel. Now moving on to the armored elites. You're going to be initiating with your first heavy attack, followed by a push block attack into another heavy attack and repeating the sequence. And yes, you guessed it, if you run out of stamina, there's a different sequence. And this one doesn't even use the push block attack, which means it costs no stamina at all and can thus be used right after your block has been broken by a storm vermin overhead attack. And it consists of a simple heavy attack into a light attack and repeating that sequence. Fucking easy, right? Also keep in mind that the Tuskgor Spear is one of the only weapons in the game capable of holding its first heavy attack indefinitely, which isn't just useful for timing your heavy attack, but actually increases your movement speed while you hold it. Although keep in mind, this only works for heavy attack 1 and not for heavy attack 2. And last but not least, the sword and shield. Finally, the last weapon. Like, my throat is literally sore from recording, which can only mean one thing. Coffee.
A few moments later.
Ah, coffee. Sweet, delicious coffee. Putting me right back into kick-ass mode. Now, as you might remember, once upon a time I mentioned something about a push radius, which you can hopefully remember since it was like 2 minutes ago. Now, I said that there was only 2 or 3 other weapons in the game which did not have a push radius of 2.5, and the sword and shield is one of those weapons. It has a push radius of 3, whilst the mace and shield still has one of 2.5. Now, the light attack sequence has what you would expect from a one-handed sword with the linesman modifier and decent cleave, which is similar to the third heavy attack, although it has more stagger and less damage. Last but not least, we have only 2 attacks that deal any armor damage, and these are the push block attack and the second heavy attack. But anyways, let's get started. Now, when it comes to fighting hordes with the sword and shield, you have a couple of options. First of all, you can just spam your light attack sequence, which is totally fine most of the time. However, versus dense hordes, this is gonna be a problem, but thankfully a solvable one, and in any scenario where you feel threatened by the horde, the safest option is to throw a push followed by your 2 first light attacks and then repeat in the sequence, since the third light attack in the sequence doesn't have a mass modifier. Now, if you're completely out of stamina and you simply feel like your light attack sequence isn't good enough, you do have a third and final option of simply doing a light attack into heavy attack and repeating that sequence, which provides one attack with slightly more stagger power, whilst also avoiding any attacks without the linesman modifier. But at the same time, it deals less damage, and the truth is, I'm actually slightly conflicted as to whether or not it's advantageous. And moving on to the unarmored elite, you're never gonna guess this one. It's the light attack sequence, who would have known? Although one thing you can do to put yourself in a slightly better position is using the shield bash in between, both to stagger the enemies and to generate temporary HP. And really, with the exception of a heavy 2 headshot, no other attack, even with headshot, is gonna deal any more damage than a single light attack, which makes the potential value questionable to say the least. And moving on to the armored elites. Now, as you hopefully recall, the sword and shield only had 2 attacks that dealt any armor damage, and these can be easily sequenced together by doing a push block attack into a heavy attack and repeating the sequence. And although the damage metrics didn't look fantastic on paper, this is in fact a fairly strong combo, for a few different reasons. First of all, it's extremely fast. But more important than that, it has forward momentum, which is always hugely advantageous when it comes to an armor damage sequence, since this allows you to move back and forth between safety and aggression. Now, on top of that, this sequence also provides really easy headshots, vastly increasing the damage listed in the armory. And if you should run out of stamina, you want to use your first heavy attack, which is the shield bash, as an initiation tool, allowing you to loop together this sequence of heavy and light attacks. In other words, you need to start out with 2 heavy attacks in a row, then follow that up by a light attack, and you simply repeat the sequence of heavy, light after that, which is a sequence that you can only loop together by doing an initial attack that isn't part of the actual looping sequence, but is required in order to actually get to the point where you can. You may ask, why? But the real question is, why not? Now, one thing you can do with either of Kruber's shielded weapons is a quite useful stagger combo, which will generate tons of temporary HP, and it basically consists of your heavy attack 1, aka the shield bash, which you sequence together with a push in order to reset the sequence, allowing you to then do another shield bash. Now, the amount of temporary HP generated will obviously vary depending on both your talents and whether you're using heroic intervention on your melee weapon. Now, another amazing tip, which just goes to prove how important it is to learn animation cancelling, can be demonstrated with the Foot Knight. Now, you can actually stop his charge at any point by simply blocking, so no matter how far you want to go, you can stop him at any point during the journey. Now, the same is true for both the Handmaiden and the Zealot, and this is especially advantageous in scenarios where you want to use your ulti and get the positive effects, but without compromising the safety of your current positioning. Or you know, maybe you're one of those weird people who prefer not falling over a cliff. Not that I can relate, but it works for that too. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, I love you guys. Stay awesome. Peace out.
Oi! Oh, face first in shit again.
Bye, have a great time.
Oh, not the ground. It always wins.
Rouse yourself, Kruber! Rise up, Kruber!